The air in the gym was thick with the smell of sweat and old leather, a familiar scent for 12-year-old Cassius Clay. He stood before Joe Martin, his coach, after another awkward training session. Cassius had tried, he really had, but his movements were clunky, his punches missing their mark more often than not. He was all gangly limbs and uncoordinated enthusiasm. Martin, a man whose patience had worn thin over many years and countless aspiring fighters, looked at him with tired eyes. "Kid," Martin said, his voice flat, cutting through the gym's background noise. "You'll never be a champion. Just give it up." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. They weren't yelled, not screamed, but delivered with a finality that stung more than any shout could. Cassius didn't flinch. He didn't argue or try to defend himself. He just stood there, absorbing the dismissal. A quiet, intense look settled on his young face, a flicker of something unyielding in his eyes. It wasn't defiance, not yet, but a deep, silent intake of Martin's pronouncement. He just took it in. He turned and walked out of the gym. The weight of Martin's words settled on his shoulders, but it wasn't crushing him. It was heavy, yes, but not the kind of weight that makes you crumble. As he walked home, his small figure moved through the streets of Louisville, a nascent resolve hardening within him. The city sounds, the distant rumble of a bus, the chatter of people on porches, all faded into a blur. His mind was on those words. Never be a champion. Some words are meant to break you, others to build a legend. Cassius kept walking, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He passed a shop window, catching his reflection in the glass. For a moment, he stopped. He didn't see a defeated boy, teary-eyed or heartbroken. He saw something else. He saw a glimmer of what could be, a shadow of a future that defied Martin's judgment. The question hung in the quiet hum of the afternoon. How would this young boy, dismissed so definitively, rise to prove everyone wrong? He just stared at his reflection, a silent promise forming in his mind. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We want to hear from you. Louisville, Kentucky, in the early 1950s, was a city of contrasts. It was vibrant, full of life, but also deeply marked by segregation. For Cassius, growing up here meant understanding the invisible lines that divided people, the unspoken rules that dictated daily life. His childhood was a mix of simple pleasures and the constant awareness of a world that wasn't always fair. His family lived modestly, their days following a rhythm of work, church, and community gatherings. There was a strong sense of belonging within their neighborhood, a network of support that helped navigate the challenges of the time. But even within this closeness, Cassius experienced the everyday slights, the small injustices that chipped away at dignity. These moments, seemingly minor, fueled a growing desire for recognition, a need to be seen and valued in a world that often overlooked people like him. The local boxing scene was a big draw. It was a place where strength and skill could earn respect, a way to make a name for yourself. Cassius first stumbled upon it, almost by accident. His bicycle had been stolen, and a police officer, Joe Martin, suggested he learn to box if he wanted to whoop the thief. The idea of learning to fight, to defend himself, was appealing. He was fascinated by the power, the discipline, the sheer spectacle of it all. The gym became a new kind of classroom, a place where he could channel his boundless energy and growing frustration. It was an escape, a challenge, and a stage all rolled into one. The gym, run by Joe Martin, was a hub of activity. Martin himself was a white police officer, a figure of authority in a time and place where that often meant unyielding power. For many young black men in Louisville, Martin's gym was one of the few places they could find structured mentorship and an outlet for their energy. It was a melting pot of different backgrounds, all drawn to the discipline of the ring. But Martin's demeanor was often stern, reflecting the societal norms of the era. He ran a tight ship, demanding respect and adherence to his methods. He believed in traditional boxing, in solid fundamentals, and he didn't have much patience for anything he considered flash or showmanship. Cassius, even as a young boy, sometimes chafed under the strictness. He was a natural showman, full of life and quick wit. He loved to talk, to boast, to make people laugh. But in Martin's gym, the focus was on quiet dedication, on drilling the same movements over and over. Martin saw Clay's exuberance as a distraction, something that needed to be reined in. He believed in breaking down a fighter to build them back up, strong and disciplined. This often meant a no-nonsense approach that clashed with Cassius's spirited personality. There were subtle tensions, small moments that, looking back, were the first cracks in their relationship. Cassius would try a fancy footwork move, something he'd seen a pro do on TV, and Martin would immediately correct him, sometimes with a sharp word. "That's not how we do it, Clay. Stick to the basics." Or Cassius would be shadowboxing, talking to himself, narrating his own imaginary fight, and Martin would interrupt, telling him to focus. It wasn't outright conflict, not yet, but a constant push and pull between the coach's rigid expectations and the boy's natural inclination to express himself. These were the seeds of their later conflict, planted in their differing temperaments and cultural backgrounds. Martin, a product of his time, valued order and conformity. Cassius, even then, was an individualist, destined to break molds. He was learning to box, but he was also learning to navigate the world of authority figures who didn't always understand him. He watched other fighters, older boys, take Martin's criticisms without a word, nodding along. But Cassius, even when he complied physically, often had a different look in his eyes. A questioning look, a look that said, "Is this really the only way?" He'd go home after training, sometimes with a bruise, sometimes with a quiet frustration. His family would ask about his day, and he'd recount the drills, the sparring, but he'd often omit the sharp words, the moments where he felt misunderstood. He respected Martin because Martin was teaching him how to fight, how to defend himself. But there was also a growing sense that Martin didn't quite get him. He saw a rough diamond that needed shaping, while Cassius felt like a star already, just waiting for the right stage. The gym was a place of hard work, sweat, and sometimes quiet resentment. Martin's stern face, his clipped instructions, became part of Cassius's daily landscape. He learned to throw a jab, to weave, to slip a punch. He learned the rhythm of the ring. But he also learned to hold back parts of himself, to suppress the natural showman that was already bubbling inside. He learned to listen, but not always to agree. And those small moments, those subtle tensions, slowly built up, creating a foundation beneath the surface. He wasn't just learning to box. He was learning to push against boundaries, even if those boundaries were set by the very man teaching him the ropes. The early days in the gym, with their subtle tensions, slowly gave way to more direct friction. Cassius, with his growing confidence and unique style, found himself clashing more often with Coach Martin. It wasn't always a shouted argument, but often a quiet, simmering disagreement that left a mark. One afternoon, during a sparring session, Cassius was trying out some fancy footwork, dancing around his opponent rather than planting his feet. He was quick, dodging punches, making his opponent miss. He thought he was doing well, but then Martin blew his whistle, stopping the session. "Clay," he barked, his voice echoing in the small gym. "What are you doing? Get your feet set. You're not dancing, you're fighting." Cassius felt a flush creep up his neck. All eyes were on him. He tried to explain, "But coach, I'm making him miss. He can't hit me." Martin just shook his head, a look of exasperation on his face. "That's not how you fight, son. That's how you get tired, and then you get knocked out. Stick to the basics. No showboating." It felt like a public reprimand, a dismissal of his natural talent. He nodded, but inside, a small part of him rebelled. He knew he was doing something different, something that worked for him. But Martin didn't see it. There were other times. Cassius would try to talk during a water break, sharing his thoughts on a fight he'd seen, maybe even predicting his own future greatness. Martin would cut him off, sometimes gently, sometimes sharply. "Less talk, more work, Clay. Champions are made in the gym, not in front of a mirror." It was meant to be motivating, but it felt like Martin was trying to silence a part of him that was essential. Cassius felt like Martin didn't understand that his words, his boasting, were as much a part of his fighting style as his jabs and hooks. He often felt overlooked for certain opportunities. Younger, less experienced fighters, who followed Martin's instructions to the letter, seemed to get more praise, more individual attention. Cassius, who often experimented and questioned, found himself on the fringes. He saw Martin spending extra time with other boys, demonstrating techniques, giving pep talks. When Cassius asked for similar guidance, he often got a curt, "You know what to do, Clay. Just do it the right way." It felt like a broken promise, a lack of belief in his unique potential. Martin's focus on traditional boxing techniques clashed hard with Clay's natural flair. Cassius wasn't built for the plodding, conventional style Martin favored. He was fast, agile, and loved to move. He wanted to float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, even before he had the words for it. But Martin saw it as undisciplined. He'd often say, "You can't win a fight just running around, Clay. You gotta stand your ground and trade blows." It wasn't physical abuse, but these emotional and psychological slights chipped away at Cassius. Martin's dismissiveness of Clay's playful, poetic talk felt like a personal attack on his character, not just his boxing. He saw it as a distraction needing to be squashed, rather than a unique strength. These experiences built up over time. The "You'll never be a champion" declaration from part 1 wasn't a random outburst. It was the culmination of countless small instances, disagreements, and misunderstandings. Each time Martin criticized his style, each time he dismissed his words, each time he overlooked his unconventional approach, it added another layer to Cassius's internal resolve. He wasn't just learning to box. He was learning to fight against the expectations of others, to trust his own instincts, even when the man teaching him seemed to doubt them. The gym became a crucible where his determination was forged, not just by the punches he threw, but by the words he absorbed and silently defied. As Cassius grew, the tensions between him and Coach Martin became even more pronounced. His boxing style was developing, becoming more distinct, and with it, the friction intensified. The gym saw more heated exchanges, not just quiet disagreements. Martin would shout, "Clay, your footwork is sloppy. You're dancing, not fighting." He hated Cassius's constant movement, his habit of pulling back at the last second, making opponents miss. What would later be called the rope-a-dope was, to Martin, just a perceived lack of discipline. He saw a fighter who wasn't committing, who wasn't staying in the pocket and trading punches like a real boxer. Cassius, however, saw it as an advantage. He was fast, he was agile, and he could tire out his opponents. He tried to explain, "Coach, if they can't hit me, they can't win. I'm saving my energy." But Martin just shook his head, his face red with frustration. "That's not how you fight, Clay. You're going to get caught eventually. Stand your ground." The arguments became a regular soundtrack to their training sessions, punctuated by the rhythmic thud of punching bags and the grunts of other boxers. Martin's patience wore thin with Cassius's perceived stubbornness, his refusal to conform to the traditional boxing mold. These conflicts weren't just private affairs between a coach and his student. Other people in the gym, other coaches, and even some of Cassius's peers watched these exchanges. Some of the older, more traditional boxers would nod in agreement with Martin, reinforcing the idea that Cassius was being difficult. "Listen to the coach, Clay," they'd say. "He knows what he's talking about." His family, too, sometimes weighed in. His mother, concerned for his safety, would tell him to respect your elders and do what the man says, while his father, more quietly, might just tell him to be smart. The unspoken judgment from other gym members, the knowing glances, all added to the pressure. Some of his younger friends, though, egged him on, secretly admiring his defiance, his flashy moves, and his bold predictions. They saw the excitement in his style, even if Martin didn't. Inside, Cassius was fighting his own battle. There were moments of self-doubt, especially after a particularly harsh dressing down from Martin. He'd stand in front of the mirror, studying his reflection, wondering if Martin was right. Maybe he was too flashy. Maybe he should just stick to the basics. He'd feel the weight of those words, the pressure to conform, threatening to crush his spirit. He'd think about giving up, about finding another path, one where he didn't have to constantly battle for his own identity. But then, something would pull him back. An inner voice, a memory of some injustice, a quiet resolve that had been building since the bicycle incident, would reignite his belief. He remembered how good it felt to be in control, to outsmart an opponent, to move in ways others couldn't. The gym itself, with its oppressive heat, the thick smell of sweat and liniment, became a crucible for these internal struggles. The echoing thud of punches, the squeak of shoes on the canvas, the distant sounds of Louisville outside, car horns, street chatter, all blended into a backdrop for Cassius's psychological weight. Every sparring session, every argument with Martin, every moment of doubt felt intensely real. He was constantly aware of the world he wanted to conquer, and the internal fight he had to win first. He knew he was different, and that difference was both his greatest strength and the source of his greatest conflict with the man who was supposed to guide him. He understood that to become the champion he envisioned, he would have to find a way to be himself, even if it meant clashing with everyone else's expectations. Then came the pivotal moment, not in some grand arena, but in the gritty, familiar confines of the Columbia Gym. It was an amateur fight, a local bout that wouldn't make headlines. Cassius was facing a much more experienced boxer, someone who had been trained in the classic, rigid style that Joe Martin so admired. Before the fight, Martin pulled Cassius aside, his voice low and firm. "Clay, I'm telling you, stick to the basics tonight. No fancy stuff, no dancing around. Get in, hit hard, and stay grounded. Don't try anything stupid." Cassius nodded, but inside, a different plan was forming. He looked at Martin, seeing not just a coach, but a wall built of old rules and doubts. When the bell rang, Cassius moved, not with the heavy, grounded footwork Martin preached, but with a lightness, a fluid grace that seemed to defy gravity. He weaved, he bobbed, he danced. His opponent, a solid, powerful fighter, swung at air. Cassius wasn't just avoiding punches, he was making his opponent chase shadows, tiring him out. He used his jabs like a painter uses a brush, quick and precise, not for power, but to set up his next move, to control the space. The crowd, initially confused, started to murmur. This wasn't how boxing was supposed to look. Martin, ringside, looked like he was about to explode. He yelled instructions, his voice hoarse, telling Cassius to stop showboating and fight like a man. But Cassius didn't listen. He couldn't. This was his truth, his way of fighting. In the third round, with his opponent visibly winded and frustrated, Cassius saw his opening. He moved in, a flurry of quick, unexpected combinations. And then, with a final, perfectly timed right hand, he dropped his opponent. The referee counted him out. Cassius had won. The gym erupted, not just with cheers for the victor, but with a buzz of disbelief. No one had seen a fighter move like that before, especially not against such a seasoned opponent. As Cassius walked back to his corner, a triumphant grin on his face, he met Martin's gaze. There was no joy in Martin's eyes, only a mixture of anger and something else, something akin to grudging surprise. "You got lucky, Clay," Martin grumbled, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Cassius knew it wasn't luck. He had proven his methods worked. He had shown that his unconventional style wasn't a flaw, but a strength. In that moment, he realized that Martin's disbelief wasn't just about his boxing technique. It was something deeper, a fear of anything that didn't fit into the established order. Martin couldn't see past the rules he knew, couldn't imagine a new way. This victory was more than just winning a fight, it was an internal revelation. Cassius understood that he couldn't wait for Martin's approval. He couldn't conform to someone else's idea of what a champion should be. He had to be himself, fully and unapologetically. It was a drastic decision, a quiet commitment he made to himself right there in the buzzing, sweaty gym. He would embrace his unique style, his personality, his poetry, and his predictions. He would train with an even fiercer self-reliance, seeking out mentors who saw his potential, not just his deviations. He wouldn't just be a boxer. He would be an artist, a showman, a force of nature. He stepped out of Martin's shadow and into his own light, fueled by the very words that were meant to diminish him. He was no longer just Cassius Clay, the boy who stole a bicycle. He was becoming Muhammad Ali, the man who would redefine boxing. The aftermath of that fight rippled through the local boxing scene. Other boxers, who had previously dismissed Cassius's flamboyant style, now watched him with a new curiosity, some even with admiration. Gym members, who had often chuckled at his boasts, started to listen more intently when he spoke. Even some of the other coaches, while still rooted in traditional methods, couldn't deny the undeniable results. Martin, though, remained a hard nut to crack. He observed Cassius's burgeoning success with a mixture of grudging respect and a stubborn refusal to fully acknowledge that his initial judgment had been so spectacularly wrong. He'd occasionally offer a terse, "Good fight, Clay," but it always felt like a concession, not a genuine endorsement. He couldn't shake off the feeling that Cassius was still just lucky, that his unconventional approach was a fluke, not a sustainable path to greatness. But Cassius didn't need Martin's full approval anymore. His internal compass was set. The "you'll never be a champion" prophecy, once a heavyweight, now felt like a feather, light and easily brushed aside by every win. His rise was meteoric. He dominated the amateur circuit, each victory solidifying his belief in his own unique process. Then came the 1960 Rome Olympics. He didn't just win gold. He captivated the world with his speed, his charisma, his sheer audacity. That gold medal, gleaming around his neck, wasn't just a symbol of athletic achievement. It was a physical manifestation of his defiance, a shining rebuttal to every doubter, especially his first coach. Turning professional, he continued to shock and awe. His early victories weren't just wins, they were performances. He talked, he rhymed, he predicted rounds, and then he delivered, often with stunning efficiency. He floated like a butterfly and stung like a bee, a style so radically different, so incredibly effective, that it forced the entire boxing world to take notice. Each quick, precise punch, each dizzying shuffle, was a direct contradiction to the criticisms he had faced in Martin's gym. He wasn't just beating opponents, he was dismantling conventional wisdom, proving that there was more than one way to achieve greatness. Martin, now watching from afar, saw his former protege become a global phenomenon. There was no dramatic fall for Martin. Life went on. But his initial, definitive dismissal of a young Cassius Clay was proven wrong in the most public and undeniable way imaginable. It was Clay's emotional victory that truly resonated, not just over the opponents he faced in the ring, but over the doubt planted by his former coach. Martin's eventual recognition of Ali's greatness, perhaps a quiet nod to a television screen, or a reluctant admission to a fellow coach, underscored Ali's triumph. It was a silent acknowledgement that sometimes the student truly does surpass the teacher, and in doing so, reshapes the entire landscape. Years later, Muhammad Ali, the global icon, would reflect on those early days. He often spoke about the power of belief, the fire that injustice can ignite, and the strength found in self-reliance. He understood that Martin's words, though painful at the time, had ironically forged the very champion he was told he could never be. That dismissal had been a catalyst, a challenge that he simply couldn't ignore. It had instilled in him a profound sense of purpose, a burning desire to prove not just to Martin, but to himself and to the world, that his unique path was not just valid, but destined for greatness. His childhood struggles, the racial prejudice he faced, and the dismissive words of his first coach all combined to fuel an unyielding spirit. True greatness, he showed us, often emerges not from conforming to expectations, but from fearlessly defying limitations and carving out your own legendary path.